10 armed men walked into a swamp to hunt one runaway slave, but within hours, something went terribly wrong. The hunter became the hunted, and one by one, they vanished without a trace. Only a single man made it out alive, and his story was so terrifying, no one believed him. What really happened inside Blackwater Swamp? Stay with me, because the truth is darker than you think. In the summer of 1851, the heat settled over the land like a heavy blanket. The air was thick, unmoving, and filled with the constant hum of insects. Life on the plantation followed the same strict rhythm every day. Sunrise brought labor, and sunset brought silence. Nothing changed. Nothing was unexpected. Until Elijah disappeared. Elijah was not the kind of man people noticed at first. He kept his head down, spoke only when necessary, and moved with quiet purpose. But those who paid attention understood there was something different about him. He was observant, always watching, always thinking. While others worked with exhaustion, Elijah worked with precision. He learned quickly, especially when it came to tools. He could fix broken equipment, carve wood with care, and tie knots that few others understood. Some whispered that he had once worked alongside skilled craftsmen before being brought to the plantation. Others believed he simply had a natural gift. Either way, the overseers found him useful, and usefulness often meant closer supervision. Yet Elijah never caused trouble. He followed orders, never argued, and never showed anger. That was what made his disappearance so shocking. It happened on a quiet night. There had been no storm, no loud noise, no sign of chaos. The sky was clear, the stars sharp and bright. The other enslaved workers slept in their quarters, exhausted from the day's labor. The guards made their usual rounds, confident that nothing would disturb the routine. But sometime between midnight and dawn, Elijah vanished. When morning came, his absence was noticed almost immediately. His sleeping place was empty. His few belongings were gone, nothing valuable, just simple items. A cloth, a small carved piece of wood, and a length of rope. At first, the overseer assumed Elijah had been taken ill or wandered off. But a quick search of the nearby area revealed nothing. No footprints. No signs of struggle. No broken fences. It was as if he had simply disappeared. The plantation owner was called at once. A large, stern man with a temper that often burned hotter than the sun above them, he refused to accept what he was hearing. A man does not vanish into thin air, he snapped. Find him. The search began immediately. Men spread out across the fields, checking barns, storage sheds, and nearby woods. Dogs were brought in to catch a scent, but they struggled. The ground was dry in some places, muddy in others, and whatever trail Elijah had left was faint, too faint. Hours passed, and frustration grew. Then, just as the sun reached its highest point, one of the trackers found something. A mark in the mud. It was small, almost unnoticeable. But to an experienced eye, it was enough. A partial footprint, pressed deep, as if someone had stepped carefully to avoid leaving a trail. The direction pointed toward a place few dared to go. Blackwater Swamp. At the mention of it, a silence fell over the group. Blackwater was not just a swamp, it was a place of stories. Thick trees blocked the sunlight, turning day into a dim, green shadow. The water was dark and still, hiding what lay beneath. Strange sounds echoed through it at night, calls that didn't belong to any known animal. Even the most experienced hunters avoided going too deep inside. Why would he go there? One man asked quietly. To hide, another replied. Or to die. But the plantation owner saw it differently. He thinks we won't follow, he said coldly. That's his mistake. By evening, the decision had been made. 10 men would go into Blackwater Swamp. They were not ordinary workers. These were men known for tracking, for hunting, for bringing back those who tried to escape. They carried rifles, knives, ropes, everything they believed they might need. They laughed as they prepared. "To think one man believes he can outsmart us," one of them said. Another added, "He won't last a day in that swamp." But among them, there was one older tracker who said nothing. He stared toward the distant tree line, where the swamp began. His face was unreadable, but his silence carried weight. Because deep down, he understood something the others did not. Elijah had not run in fear. He had chosen that swamp. And no one chooses Blackwater without a reason. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the 10 men stood at the edge of the dark water. The air felt colder there. Heavier. Without another word, they stepped forward, disappearing into the shadows of the swamp. They believed they were beginning a hunt. None of them realized they had already stepped into one. The men entered Blackwater Swamp at first light. A thin layer of fog hovered just above the ground, twisting between the trees like something alive. The air felt different here, cooler, heavier, and thick with the scent of wet earth and decay. Sunlight struggled to break through the dense canopy above, leaving the swamp in a constant, dim green shadow. For a moment, no one spoke. Then one of the men laughed, breaking the silence. "Just trees and water," he said. "Nothing to fear." The others nodded, gripping their rifles a little tighter as they moved forward. At the front of the group were the trackers. They crouched low, studying the ground carefully. It wasn't easy. This was not open land. The swamp floor shifted between soft mud, shallow water, and tangled roots. A footprint could disappear within minutes. But Elijah had left signs. Not obvious ones. Not careless ones. But signs, nonetheless. A bent reed. A faint depression in the mud. A broken twig that hadn't yet dried. "He came this way," one tracker whispered. The group followed. At first, their confidence remained strong. They moved steadily, pushing through hanging vines and stepping over pools of dark water. Insects buzzed around them, biting at exposed skin. Somewhere in the distance, something splashed. But as the hours passed, the swamp seemed to change. The ground grew softer, forcing them to slow down. The trees became thicker, their twisted trunks forming natural walls that blocked easy movement. The fog never fully lifted, it only shifted, drifting between them and making it difficult to see more than a few yards ahead. Then came the first mistake. One of the men stepped forward onto what looked like solid ground. The surface was covered in leaves, dry and safe-looking. But the moment his weight shifted, the ground gave way. He sank instantly, mud swallowing his legs up to the waist. He shouted in panic, dropping his rifle as he struggled. The more he moved, the deeper he sank. "Don't move," another man yelled, rushing to grab him. It took 3 men to pull him out. When they finally freed him, he lay on the ground, breathing heavily, covered in thick black mud. His boots were gone, lost beneath the surface. The others tried to laugh it off. "Watch your step," someone joked. But the laughter didn't last long. Because the ground he stepped on had looked perfect. Too perfect. They moved more carefully after that. Every step was tested. Every patch of ground questioned. And then they found the rope. It stretched between 2 trees at chest height, thin and nearly invisible against the dark background. One of the men spotted it just in time, raising his hand to stop the others. "What is this?" he muttered. The rope was tied tightly, with skill. Not a loose knot, not something thrown together in haste. This was deliberate. "A warning," one of them said. "Or a trap," another replied. They looked around, suddenly aware of how quiet the swamp had become. No birds. No distant splashes. Just the sound of their own breathing. They cut the rope and continued forward, but something had shifted. The confidence they had carried into the swamp was beginning to crack. By midday, they realized something even more troubling. The trail they were following didn't make sense. Elijah's path twisted and turned in strange ways. At times, it seemed direct, leading deeper into the swamp. Then suddenly, it would loop back, crossing over itself. In some places, the signs disappeared completely, only to reappear yards away in a direction that made no sense. "It's like he's circling us," one man said. "That's impossible," another snapped. "He's running, not thinking." But the older tracker remained quiet again. He had seen something like this before. Not from a desperate man, but from someone who knew exactly what they were doing. By late afternoon, exhaustion began to set in. The heat, the insects, and the constant tension wore them down. Their clothes were soaked with sweat and swamp water. Their movements slowed. Still, they pressed on. They had come too far to turn back. As the sun began to set, the swamp grew darker. The shadows deepened, blending together until it became difficult to tell where the ground ended and the water began. The fog thickened once more, wrapping around them like a curtain. "We make camp here," the leader ordered. They found a small patch of dry land, just large enough for the group to rest. It wasn't ideal, but it would have to do. A fire was lit, its weak glow pushing back the darkness just enough to see each other's faces. No one laughed now. No one joked. They sat in silence, listening. That's when one of the men spoke, his voice low. "Do you feel that?" "Feel what?" another asked. He hesitated. "Like, we're not alone." The others shifted uncomfortably, glancing into the darkness beyond the firelight. The swamp stared back at them. Unmoving. Endless. And somewhere within it, hidden beyond sight, was Elijah. Watching. Waiting. And as the fire crackled softly, one truth settled into every man's mind. They were no longer in control of this hunt. Night settled over Blackwater Swamp like a heavy curtain. The small fire the men had built flickered weakly, its light barely pushing back the thick darkness around them. Beyond that glow, the swamp felt endless, silent, watchful, and alive in a way none of them could explain. The men sat close together, their earlier confidence now gone. Every sound mattered. A branch snapping in the distance. Water shifting somewhere unseen. The low hum of insects rising and falling like a warning. No one slept easily. The man who had nearly sunk into the mud earlier sat with his back against a tree, staring into the darkness. Another checked his rifle again and again, his hands slightly trembling. Even the leader seemed tense, his eyes constantly scanning the shadows. Only the older tracker remained still, listening more than watching. "He's close," he said quietly. A few men turned toward him. "You don't know that," one replied. The tracker didn't argue. He simply looked out into the swamp. "He's not running," he said after a moment. "He's waiting." Those words settled heavily over the group. Before anyone could respond, a sudden sharp snap broke the silence. It came from just beyond the edge of the firelight. Then, a scream. One of the men had stepped away from the group, just a few feet into the darkness. Now he lay on the ground, shouting in pain. The others rushed toward him, raising their rifles, eyes searching for movement. "What happened?" the leader barked. The man pointed downward, his face twisted in agony. A trap. It was hidden beneath a thin layer of leaves and mud. Two thick pieces of sharpened wood had snapped shut around his leg, held together by twisted vines pulled tight like a spring. Blood began to soak through his torn pants. "Get it off," he shouted. It took effort to pry the trap open. The wood resisted, tightly bound and cleverly designed. Whoever made it knew exactly how to apply pressure. When they finally freed him, his leg was badly injured, deep cuts, possibly broken. "He won't walk," one man said grimly. The leader cursed under his breath. "This wasn't luck," the older tracker muttered. "It was placed here, for us." They dragged the injured men back to the fire. The mood had changed completely now. This was no longer a simple search. "This is madness," one of them said. "He built this alone." No one answered. Because deep down, they were beginning to understand the truth. Elijah had prepared this. Carefully. Patiently. The fire burned lower as the night stretched on. They decided to keep watch in turns. No one would wander off alone again. No one would step into the darkness without warning. But fear does strange things to the mind. As hours passed, exhaustion crept in. The sounds of the swamp seemed to grow louder. Or perhaps the silence between them grew heavier. At some point, one of the men stood up quietly. "I need to check something," he whispered. "Stay close," another replied. He nodded and stepped just beyond the firelight. Moments passed. Then minutes. No sound. No return. "Where is he?" someone asked. The group stood, calling his name softly at first, then louder. No answer. They grabbed a lantern and searched the nearby area. There were no signs of struggle. No footprints leading away. No broken branches. It was as if he had vanished into the swamp itself. Panic began to rise. "That's impossible," one man said, his voice shaking. He couldn't just disappear. But the truth stood in front of them. 2 men were now gone from their group. 1 injured. 1 missing. The leader tried to regain control. "We stay together," he ordered firmly. "No one moves alone. Not for any reason." The others nodded quickly. But the fear in their eyes was clear. They returned to the fire, sitting closer than before. No one spoke much now. The weight of what was happening pressed down on them. The older tracker leaned forward, his face lit by the fading fire. "He's using the swamp," he said quietly. "Every step we take, he's already thought about it." "You're saying he planned all this?" someone asked. "Yes." "That's not possible," another man snapped. "He's just one man." The tracker looked at him steadily. "One man who knows this place better than we ever will." Silence followed. The idea settled into their minds, whether they wanted to accept it or not. Elijah was not lost. He was not desperate. He was in control. As the night continued, no one slept at all. They listened. They waited. And somewhere, just beyond the reach of their firelight, something moved. Not loudly. Not carelessly. But with purpose. By the time dawn finally broke, the men looked different. Tired. Uneasy. Changed. They had entered the swamp as hunters. But now, for the first time, they truly understood. They were being hunted. Morning came slowly to Blackwater Swamp. A weak, gray light filtered through the thick canopy above, barely cutting through the fog. The fire from the night before had burned down to ash. The men sat around it in silence, their faces pale, their eyes hollow from a night without sleep. 3 were already gone. 1 lay injured, unable to stand. And the swamp felt different. "He's pushing us," the older tracker said quietly, breaking the silence. No one argued this time. They had all felt it. The traps, the strange paths, the disappearance in the night, it was too precise to be chance. Elijah wasn't just surviving in the swamp. He was controlling it. "We leave," one man said suddenly. "We take the injured and head back. Now." A few others nodded quickly. But the leader shook his head. "We don't even know which way back is." That truth hit hard. In their focus on tracking Elijah, they had not marked their own path clearly. The swamp looked the same in every direction: trees, water, fog. The few signs they had left behind were gone or impossible to find. "We follow the sun," another suggested weakly. The older tracker looked up at the sky, barely visible through the thick leaves. "You can't see it long enough," he replied. Silence returned. They were lost. The leader stood, gripping his rifle tighter. "We move forward," he said. "Find higher ground. Get a clear view." It wasn't a good plan, but it was the only one they had. They lifted the injured men between them and began moving again. This time, there was no confidence in their steps. Every movement was slow, careful, suspicious. The swamp seemed to close in around them. The air felt thicker, harder to breathe. The ground shifted constantly, solid one moment, soft the next. Then came the next trap. A loud crack echoed as one of the men stepped forward. Before anyone could react, the ground beneath him collapsed. He fell into a deep pit, hidden beneath branches and leaves. The sound of impact was followed by a terrible scream. They rushed to the edge, looking down. Sharpened stakes lined the bottom. The man had fallen directly onto them. He was still alive, but barely. Blood spread quickly beneath him. "Pull him out," someone shouted. But no one moved. They all knew. It was too late. The men below gasped once, then went still. No one spoke for a long time after that. They covered the pit as best they could, not out of respect, but out of fear. Fear that looking at it too long would break something inside them completely. "He knew we'd step there," one of them whispered. "He knows every step," another replied. The group moved on, but now, they were different. They no longer walked like hunters. They moved like prey. Eyes constantly searching. Breathing shallow. Flinching at every sound. As the day dragged on, the traps became more frequent. Some were simple, sharp sticks hidden beneath water. Others were more complex, false paths leading into deep mud or circles that brought them back to the same place. At one point, they realized they had passed the same twisted tree 3 times. "We're going in circles," one man said, panic rising in his voice. "No," the older tracker replied. "We're being led in circles." The difference was worse. Arguments began to break out. "This is your fault," one man shouted at the leader. "You brought us here." "We all came," the leader snapped back. "You said it would be easy." "Enough," the older tracker shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. They fell silent. "This is what he wants," he said. "Fear. Confusion. If we turn on each other, we won't last another hour." But it was already happening. The swamp wasn't just attacking their bodies. It was breaking their minds. By late afternoon, another man disappeared. One moment he was there, walking beside them. The next, he was gone. No sound. No trace. Just empty space where he had been. That was the moment something inside the group finally broke. "I'm getting out of here," one man shouted, turning and running blindly into the trees. "Stop," the leader yelled. But he didn't stop. He vanished into the fog within seconds. They heard him crashing through the brush for a short while. Then a distant scream. Then nothing. The remaining men stood frozen. No one suggested going after him. They knew better now. Chasing into the swamp alone was a death sentence. As evening approached, only a handful of them remained. Exhausted. Terrified. Broken. Then, just as the light began to fade again, they stumbled upon something unexpected. A structure. Small. Hidden between thick trees and covered with branches. A shelter. They approached it slowly, weapons raised. Inside, they found tools. Rope. Carved wood pieces. And markings etched into the walls, lines, symbols, shapes that looked like maps. The older tracker stepped closer, studying them carefully. "These are paths," he said. "Routes through the swamp." "His routes?" someone asked. The tracker nodded. "He's been planning this for a long time." The realization hit harder than any trap. Elijah hadn't just escaped. He had prepared. Every step they had taken, every mistake they had made. He had already predicted it. The swamp wasn't random. It was a design. A weapon. And they had walked straight into it. As darkness fell once more, only 3 men remained standing. The leader. The older tracker. And one other, barely holding himself together. They looked at each other, knowing the truth without saying it. This was no longer a hunt. It was survival. And they were running out of time. Night fell over Blackwater Swamp for the second time. But this night felt different. Heavier. Darker. As if the swamp itself had been waiting for this moment. Only 3 men remained. Their clothes were torn, soaked with sweat and swamp water. Their hands shook, their eyes restless and wide. The confidence they once carried had completely vanished, replaced by something far more dangerous, pure, desperate fear. They stood near the small hidden shelter they had discovered, unsure of what to do next. "We stay here," the leader said, trying to sound firm. "It's the only place we understand." "No," the third man replied quickly, his voice trembling. "This is his place. We need to leave. Now." The older tracker said nothing at first. He studied the ground, the trees, the faint markings carved into the shelter walls. Then he spoke quietly. "There is no leaving anymore." The words hung in the air. "What do you mean?" the leader asked. The tracker looked up slowly. "Everything we've done, every direction we've taken, it's all been controlled. Even finding this place, it wasn't luck." A long silence followed. "You're saying he wanted us here?" the third man whispered. The tracker nodded once. Before anyone could respond, a sudden sound broke through the stillness. A crack. Then another. Like wood shifting, or footsteps moving carefully through shallow water. All 3 men froze. "Did you hear that?" the leader whispered. No one answered. Because they all had. The sound came again. Closer this time. Slow. Measured. Not the careless movement of an animal, but something deliberate. The third man raised his rifle, his hands shaking badly now. "Show yourself," he shouted into the darkness. The swamp did not respond. But then. A faint glow appeared through the trees. Fire. Small at first, then growing brighter. It flickered across the water ahead of them, casting long shadows that twisted and stretched across the swamp. And then they saw him. Standing on the other side of a narrow stretch of dark water. Elijah. For the first time since the hunt began, he was fully visible. He stood still, holding a torch in one hand. His face was calm, almost expressionless. There was no panic in his eyes. No fear. Only focus. Only control. For a moment, no one moved. No one spoke. The leader stepped forward slightly, raising his weapon. "It's over," he said, though his voice lacked its earlier strength. "You've got nowhere left to run." Elijah didn't react. He simply watched them. "You should have stayed away," Elijah said quietly. His voice was steady. Clear. Not the voice of a hunted man. But of someone who had already decided the outcome. The third man fired suddenly. The shot echoed loudly through the swamp. But Elijah had already moved. The bullet struck nothing but trees and fog. "Where did he?" the men began. Then the ground beneath them shifted. A loud crack split the air. The earth gave way. All 3 men dropped instantly. They fell into darkness as the ground collapsed beneath their feet, a wide, carefully hidden pit. The impact was violent. The leader hit first, landing hard against the side. The third man fell beside him with a cry of pain. The older tracker landed last, managing to avoid the worst of it, but not entirely. For a moment, there was only silence. Then groaning. Struggling. The pit was deep, its walls steep and slick with mud. Broken branches and sharpened stakes lined parts of it, not enough to kill instantly, but enough to injure and trap. The leader tried to stand, but his leg gave out beneath him. "We have to get out," he said through clenched teeth. But even as he said it, he knew. They couldn't. Above them, the light from the torch flickered. Elijah stepped into view at the edge of the pit. Looking down. Watching. The third man raised his rifle again, but his hands were too unsteady. Before he could aim properly, a rope dropped suddenly, knocking the weapon from his grip. Another trap. Another move already planned. "Why are you doing this?" the leader demanded, his voice now filled with anger and fear. Elijah said nothing at first. He studied them for a long moment. Then he spoke. "You came here to hunt me," he said. "You thought I would run. That I would hide." He tilted his head slightly. "I learned this place," he continued. "Every path. Every step. I waited." The older tracker closed his eyes briefly. He understood now. This had never been an escape. It had been preparation. "You planned all of this," the tracker whispered. Elijah looked at him. "Yes." Silence fell again. The swamp seemed to hold its breath. Finally, Elijah stepped back. The torchlight began to fade as he turned away. "Wait," the leader shouted. But there was no answer. Only darkness. Hours later, as dawn slowly crept into the swamp, one man managed to climb out. The third man. Injured. Bleeding. Barely alive. He crawled through the swamp for what felt like days, though it was likely only hours. His body was broken, his mind worse. When he finally reached the edge of Blackwater, he collapsed. He was found later that day. But his story was not believed. 10 men had entered the swamp. Only one returned. As for Elijah, he was never seen again. Some say he escaped far beyond the reach of those who hunted him. Others believe he never left the swamp at all. That he became part of it. And even now, years later, people who go too close to Blackwater Swamp at night speak of strange things. Soft footsteps. Shadows moving just beyond sight. And the feeling that someone is watching. Not with fear, but with patience. Waiting for those who dare to enter.